Nikon launched the Z6III in June of this year at £2,700 or $2,700 US. And personally, I think they got the pricing wrong, especially in Europe, where a lot of people felt that it was too much, it was too expensive. And as a result, I think that a few people shied away from buying the Z6III that might have otherwise. However, it's currently on offer at £2,300 or $2,500 US, and that's making it a lot more palatable and a lot more interesting. I think at this price point of £2,300, it's a really, really good value. So let's dive into this camera, discuss why I think it's a fantastic hybrid 24 megapixel camera, its strengths, perhaps some about its weaknesses, and hopefully help you to learn more about this wonderful little device. So first off, it carries the similar body to the Z6II or Z6 if those are cameras that you've tried. It weighs about 750 grams, so a little bit heavier than both of those cameras. However, it also feels very similar in the hand, and therefore you don't necessarily notice the extra weight. It's actually a bit thicker than the Z6II, for instance. It also carries across some new features from the Z8, Z9 and ZF, and that's due to it using Nikon's Expeed 7 image processor. That image processor, I think, was pretty much key to Nikon solving its autofocus problem that a lot of people said it had with its previous mirrorless cameras. The autofocus in this camera is very, very good. It's also highly customizable, which is something you need to consider if you buy this camera. You need to spend time to learn the autofocus system and the different capabilities that it has. For instance, this camera has 3D tracking, something that was initially seen in Nikon's Pro DSLRs, well, all its DSLRs in fact, but it's something that was really revered in its Pro DSLRs, and we now have it on the mirrorless cameras too, and it's the same as the Z8 and Z9. That 3D tracking mode is really useful if, for instance, you're doing wildlife or sports photography. It also has enhanced subject detection. So it has an auto mode where it will just do what it can depending on what it sees, but you can also have face detection, animal detection, car, so if you're doing motorsports, so car detection and plane detection. An interesting omission here is that it doesn't have bird detection, which is something other Nikon Expeed 7 processor cameras have, and I'm hoping we'll see in a software update, though I wouldn't necessarily count on it. The Expeed 7 processor also allows faster processing of the images, logically enough, and also better video modes versus the previous Z6 line of cameras. When it comes to speed of taking photographs, this camera is up there. It can do 20 frames per second JPEG and indeed RAW images at the same time, and it can do up to 200 frames before it seems to arbitrarily stop and you have to press the button again and you can do the whole thing again. It's very impressive and very quick. Now there is a caveat once again to that 20 frames per second, which is that that is in electronic shutter mode. So this does have a physical shutter, but you can also do it in electronic shutter mode only, and it will not necessarily guarantee that it will expose your images in between. If you dial things down to 16 frames per second, then the camera can actually do the exposure as well as guaranteed. If you want to use the actual shutter in the camera rather than electronic shutter, you're limited to up to 12 frames per second or 8 frames per second, again with that guaranteed exposure check. It's something to keep in mind, but I think that in terms of purely the maximum capabilities of the camera, they are very good and again are improved on previous cameras. It also has a JPEG only modes for up to 120 frames per second, which is super cool. It'll do 30 and 60 at full frame and then 120 with a DX crop. And in those JPEG only modes, you can also have pre-release capture, which basically means that you can capture up to 1 second of images from before you press the shutter button when you take a photo. So for instance, you're doing sports or wildlife and you almost miss that moment, pressing that shutter button means that you'll get the previous second and hopefully get the shot that you needed or wanted. In order to save all this data, you have 2 card slots on the camera as well. You've got an SD card slot and a compact flash express Type B card slot. I would argue that you can record most things to the CF Express Type B, but you can use the SD card as an overflow. That's what I tend to do. The Expeed 7 processor also gives us some fantastic new video capabilities. This is Nikon's first 6K video camera. Previously we had 4K and 8K, so it's nice to see Nikon widening the scope of what they can do. It has full Nikon NRAW 12-bit video recording for up to 6K at 30 frames a second, or you can do up to 4K in 60 frames a second, or indeed 4K 120 frames a second with a DX crop on the image. There are some caveats depending on whether you're shooting Nikon NRAW, ProRes RAW and 12-bit, ProRes and 10-bit, H.264, H.265 in 10-bit, or indeed 8-bit, that will limit you a little bit. But for instance, that could be a slight change to the resolution or a crop factor of some kind. But overall, this is very capable when it comes to video, and it certainly produces some fantastic video image as well. It's great being able to shoot Nikon log, N-log in the video, in the camera as well. So that means that you actually can have a flat profile on the video and then color grade it yourself. That's something that we've had on other Nikon cameras such as Z8 and Z9, but recording that internally is really cool. It can also export up to a 4K image onto a video recorder like a Atomos Ninja 5, and you can record that 4K via the Atomos Ninja, which is great also in N-log if you want as well. So if you want to use an external recorder, you absolutely can. And you can do that through the HDMI port on the side, which is great. It's a full-size HDMI, no more HDMI mini or micro cables. This is the full thing, which means you'll always have a cable about and easily accessible. Very handy, nice to have that, and it's a lot more secure than those other options as well. This camera also has some fantastic slow-mo capabilities, up to 240 frames per second in HD, which is, I think, really cool. And I think it's definitely better than my Z8. So that's really nice. I've enjoyed shooting with it. I don't do a huge amount of slow-mo, but having the option to use it occasionally has been fun. And 240 frames per second is something quite special and quite impressive for this level of camera. In terms of recording time, you're not actually limited by Nikon, which is nice. Though, again, you're going to be limited by the battery and the recording media. So what is the battery life like? Battery life in Nikon's latest Z cameras is hard to define. However, I have easily got well over 1,500 images out of the camera. I've also shot about an hour of video without any issues on a single battery. But this camera does have a USB-C port, and that USB-C port is USB-C power delivery compatible. What that means is you can plug in a compatible power bank or charger with USB-C cable, and this camera will run and run and run. It's really, really cool. And it means you don't use the internal battery. You can also charge the internal battery with USB-C power delivery as well. In fact, I believe in some markets you don't even get a charger in the box, so you'll want to use that USB-C cable to charge the camera. Which is what I do anyway, so it doesn't make a difference to me. I never took the ones out of the box on my Z6II or my Z8 or my Z6. I always use USB-C power delivery cables. But yeah, that's really cool. So battery life is quite good. I would, however, and I've used this definition on my Z8 too, I find, personally, I get about 4 hours use out of these cameras. So what that means is one battery, 4 hours. Because I won't necessarily switch my camera off between shots, I'll kind of leave it running, and you kind of naturally press the shutter button a bit, and you're framing a photo, you take a few photos, you walk around a bit more. I find about 4 hours, then I want to change batteries. You can get more, you can get a lot more, you can also get a lot less. So it depends on how you shoot. So battery life is so hard to define now. It's a lot more difficult than when we had DSLRs due to the EVFs and the screens, etc. It all changes. But that's what I'm finding. About 4 hours typical photography use when I'm out and about, and then I'll want to change batteries. Video-wise, as I've already covered, that will depend on what format you're shooting. It will depend on what resolution, etc., etc. Even the shooting environment. But about an hour to maybe an hour and a half on a single battery. You can get a battery grip for this that will give you 2 batteries. I wouldn't bother. I'd just use a USB-C power delivery power bank. Very cheap, very handy. Practically unlimited power if you have a large enough power bank. So that's sort of the headline features on video. Autofocus in video, by the way, very good. Subject detection, very good. Feels great. This camera has a partially stacked sensor. Now, the Z8 and Z9 have a stacked sensor. The ZF has a standard sensor. This has a partially stacked sensor. I don't want to go into the specifics on this because I will not explain it as well as other people have done. However, what this means is you have a readout speed of about 10 milliseconds, which is very good for this level and price of camera. And what that means is less chance of having rolling shutter when you're using the electronic shutter, which is important if you're taking like those high 20 frames per second photographs and you have a fast moving object. It will stop the chance of that object being distorted as a result of rolling shutter. That also affects video, and it means your video doesn't really tend to get much rolling shutter as an issue either, which is great. Now, if you're shooting stills, you can use the actual shutter in this camera and get around that problem entirely because you're not using the electronic shutter, which means no rolling shutter. But in video, you can't get around it, so it's great to have that fast readout time due to the partially stacked sensor, which gives you a essentially better image out of it. Not something I've run into though. Now, controversy time. Dynamic range is really bad with the Z6III. It's not. What this comes down to is, scientifically speaking, this camera has less dynamic range than the Z6II and other cameras in that class. But it is only marginally less. It is a percentage less. And I haven't noticed it. With the video that I've edited from this and the stills I've edited and the stills I've looked at, I'm very happy with the images on this camera. They look really good, and I can't really tell the difference to the Z6II or Z8 images that much. Like, it's not enough that I can tell. The Z8 you kind of notice because the high resolution, what you can do with the file, but beyond that, there just isn't a difference. So to me, 4K video out of this, 4K video out of the Z8, I can't really see the difference. Now, that's not to say there isn't one. So if you're someone that you know you're going to be shooting in extreme situations, maybe extreme lighting conditions or lots of shooting at night, that may be a concern for you, at which point this might not be the right camera for you. If you're going to be maxing out those images and that video all the time, this may not be the right camera. If, however, you use a camera in relatively normal scenarios most of the time, you probably won't notice. But I wanted to address it because I know loads of people have commented on dynamic range, and it is something a lot of people are concerned about, especially at the launch of this camera, so it is something to consider. Another difference to this camera as well, the Nikon cameras, is the viewfinder, the electronic viewfinder, the EVF. It is higher resolution and it is brighter than the ones in other Nikon Z cameras. This is arguably the best EVF that Nikon has. Now, for the most part, you won't tell the difference. I can't tell the difference most of the time. When you're taking stills, you won't tell the difference between the Z8, a Z6II, Z9, etc. It's all pretty much the same in my opinion. Perhaps slightly brighter, but I can't tell. Now, there is a time when you will notice. If you're shooting, say, HDR video, looking through this electronic viewfinder, you will be able to see a difference. It will look better in here. It has a better screen that is able to reproduce color more accurately than other Nikon cameras. But if you're taking stills, you won't notice, in my opinion. And even if you're taking video, unless you're really, really trying to pay attention, you won't really notice either. That's fine. It's a great viewfinder. I think Nikon's other viewfinders are great too. They looked really good. I really enjoyed using them. But it's something to consider. The EVF in here is better. The monitor on the back, I think, is the same as the Z8, pretty much. Potentially slightly brighter. I can't entirely remember, but I don't think there's much in it. The monitor is good. The monitor is also a flippy articulating screen affair. Now, there are benefits and there are indeed some challenges with this. Benefit number one, you can flip the screen and close it so that there is a plastic back on the back and you will not scratch it when it's in your bag. That's really handy. I get around that by putting tempered glass screen protectors on all my screens, and before I sell them, I just take the screen protector off and the screen looks like new. But it's still useful to have this because this will protect the screen from like a knock more so than the tempered glass screen protector will. What I do not like is it's a bit more fiddly if you're trying to get low to the ground while taking photos and you flip the screen out. Now the screen's out on the side of the camera and I find it gets in the way. I prefer the sort of tilting affairs that we've had on the Z8 and Z9 and indeed on the Z6II more so, but perhaps it's just because I'm used to it. Personal preference, I don't like it, but what this can do is like a full-on selfie mode. So if you want to use this camera in full-on selfie mode, you absolutely can. You can't do that with the other Nikon cameras, so something to consider there. The screen, other than that, is good. It's obviously a touch screen like all Nikon Zs are, but it's kind of nice. I'm not such a fan of the flipping. Also, part of the problem here for me is if you are using it selfie mode and you have cables in here, the cables are going to block the screen, and also the cables just generally get in the way of being able to articulate the screen. So if you're doing video and you've got everything connected, you aren't actually going to be able to use it how you want to anyway, and you're always going to have it at a weird angle, at which point you may as well have the flipping affair from the Z8. So, ISO performance. Let's have a chat about that. I always find this is something quite personal. So, here are the images. You can have a look. I've just chosen a little setup on my table here, and you can decide what you think of it. I've turned the studio lights down a bit, and we're just going through the ISO settings, and these are all the main sort of ISO settings, and you can decide what you think of the high ISO performance. It is better than something like the Z8 and Z9 due to the fact there's less megapixels in the sensor, and you have larger pixels, but overall, I think the high ISO performance in this camera is pretty much identical to my Z6II, which is no bad thing, as I really like that too. Overall, yeah, it's the high ISO performance on this camera I think is very good, and this is very usable. Now, I would like to come back to the connections on the side. The mic input on this camera is kind of special. It's high quality than we've seen in like the Z6II and other older Nikon Z cameras, but it can also, when paired with the correct like Tascam recorder, input a like particular recording format from the Tascam directly into the camera that is higher quality. I do not have that recorder, so I cannot test this and I cannot explain it properly. But in theory, it's just going to give you a high quality sound directly into the camera, though I think the audio sounds slightly better into the camera than it did previously anyway, so that's something to keep in mind of. It does have microphones built in. They're never going to sound great. It's just more of like an emergency case, but it's very useful when syncing audio. So for instance, I will record all my audio to my Tascam recorder, and then I will sync the files in Premiere, and so having an audio track on here recorded with the Z6III allows me to sync them up nice and easily. So something to keep in mind. Overall, the Nikon Z6III is a very capable camera. In my opinion, it was priced too highly when it was first announced, and it led to people like me buying a Z8 instead of a Z6III, or indeed other cameras or indeed other brands. I think that now the price is sort of starting to come down a little bit. The Z6III is actually a good value. Now, I think it's a very capable camera too. If you don't need higher resolution files like you get from the Z8 and the Z9, for me it's a choice between the Z6III and the ZF. My issue with the ZF is that I don't like the ergonomics of the camera, and actually, to be honest, I don't really like the controls. I didn't grow up with that older retro style, so although it's really cool and it looks really nice, I don't really get on with them day to day. So to me, the Z6III would be the choice any day of the week. I like the way the camera handles and feels, and its video capabilities are truly astonishing versus the Z6II that I'm using to record this video. The autofocus performance is also not comparable. It is so much better than the Z6II and previous Z cameras that don't have the Expeed 7 processor. Sometimes I don't feel like it's quite as good as the Z8, and I don't think I said that in my Z8 versus Z6III video, but it's to within like 95%, but I can't quite put my finger on why I feel that. I feel like sometimes the tracking isn't quite as sharp, but perhaps that's something that we'll see Nikon change in firmware anyway. And that's actually something that I want to end on, and that's Nikon's firmware updates. In previous cameras, we've seen incredible features added through firmware updates, whether it be in the original Z6, which practically became a Z6II by the end of its firmware updates, or indeed the features added in the Z8 and Z9. Now, people have had high expectations for Nikon's firmware updates to add new features and add new capabilities to their cameras. But I would like to add a little bit of a caveat to this and a little bit of a warning. The Nikon Z6II didn't see a huge amount of updates because I think they had maxed out the capabilities of the Expeed 6 processor by the time it was launched. But people like me and many other people, we expected there to be updates and to get better autofocus and new features and new capabilities, and they never came. There are still people out there waiting for Z6II updates that are never going to come. And I don't think the Z6III is going to see a huge amount of updates either. Now, I do hope we get bird detection mode for the autofocus, bird tracking, but I don't think we're going to get as many updates as we did with the Z6III. And the reason for that is the Expeed 7 processor has been around for a while. We've seen it in the Z8 and Z9. I think the Z9 is now on firmware version 5, or at least we're expecting to see firmware version 5 very soon. I think it's on 5. I'm not making that up. And every time we've seen that big number change, we've seen a whole load of features added. And that's been really cool. But the Z6III has the Expeed 7 processor from those cameras, and they've already had all those updates. And I think there's talk of a new Nikon Z9 Mark II or Z9 II in the next couple of years, next year or the year after. So maybe we'll see some updates on Z6III, but I doubt we'll see the same level of updates as we saw on the Z6, purely because it's kind of nearing the end of its like research path on the processor, and that's, I think, the thing that limits us. So that's something to keep in mind of. That isn't to say Nikon hasn't added features to this camera that we haven't seen in the Z8 and Z9. So in lieu of those future updates, we already have Nikon Imaging Cloud. We have new picture controls, which gives us the ability to create our own looks that are baked into images, JPEGs, when we take them. That's not something that you can do on Z8 or Z9 yet. So this camera actually has things which those flagship cameras don't have yet. So from that perspective, perhaps Nikon's already kind of given you the additional features that you were going to get otherwise. You know, I think pixel shift, being able to take higher resolution images through that, the pre-capture, all those things were added, whereas this has them out the box. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you're like, I'm buying this with the view that in 3 years' time it's going to be like even better camera, I would be skeptical of that. So yeah, that is my review of the Nikon Z6III. I think it's an incredibly capable camera. It is a very powerful camera, and Nikon's done a great job. It was priced too highly. It's now come down in price, and I think it's a really good value. If you have any questions about the camera, pop them in the comment section below. There's a link to Amazon where you can buy one if you want. That is an affiliate link, so I get sort of a bit of a kickback from that if you do buy one, but that really does help me out, so please do if you are going to buy one from Amazon. Equally, if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe, as that really does help me out as well. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope I see you again next time. Goodbye.